morning. You're joining CareStack and Tusk partners for our webinar today on insights to scaling your dental practice. We're going to give it a moment or two for more people to join the call, and then we'll get started. So as people join the call, it's 1 o'clock Eastern time, 10 a.m. on the West Coast. This is Jim Gerson. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing for CareStack. I'm here with Perrin and Diwakar Sinha, who's joining here any moment. He's having some technical difficulties on his end. Just a quick minute of housekeeping, and then we'll get started if that's all right. So everyone who's in this call right now is placed automatically into listen-only mode. So you don't have to worry about any background disruptions or so forth. If you have a question, I'm going to act as a chief moderator today. Please go ahead and use the Q&A button that's down at the bottom of the screen. And we certainly will build in time to today's program to answer your questions. It just depends if we're going to answer it during the actual presentation or if we're going to put it into a parking lot of sorts and address them at the end of today's program. So Perrin, can you hear me okay? Is the quality of the connection coming up all right?
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear. Good connection on my end, and I think my partner Diwakar is on, but he was having some issues with the camera on his. So yeah.
Okay, Diwakar, you're just going to want to go ahead and unmute your line here in a moment. And Perrin, if you want to go ahead and start. So this is going to be the focus of our program today. Confronting three key to building a successful practice. And I'm just going to give a quick moment of background here on CareStack. I promise this is the only plug for our company in the next 45 minutes, but I want to talk about who we are and what our place in the market is and why we're kind of doing this, because we don't really have a tremendous amount of brand equity. We're a nascent organization that was started in 2015, offering a all-in-one cloud-based solution for dental practices to manage the business components of their dental practice. And we typically work with two types of clients: the dental practice that's growing, adding operatories or adding locations, and sees technology as enabling them to grow and to continue that growth, just don't know how to get there. And the second is, they're also visionaries, they're ambitious, but they're frustrated and aggravated by managing many different subscriptions to run the dental practice. And a lot of times it produces stress or sleepless nights. And a key element of CareStack, as you can see here from this one slide, is that we have all of this functionality in one single secure login per user. So we're based in Orlando. We have 230 employees worldwide, and we're currently in over 530 dental practices. And one of our missions in the dental space, and I know we're in a very challenging time as of this week, everyone knows, right, is we really believe in a rising tide floats all boats. We work closely in conjunction with Tusk partners. We think they bring tremendous value to both the single practitioner looking to grow their business or people that have started DSOs or groups who want to continue to grow and scale. And so we're thrilled to be joined by two of the principals today, Diwakar and Perrin. And again, Diwakar, I know you've got a little bit of a cough there, but you're going to need to unmute your line at some point here. So I'm going to turn it over to Perrin. And please, if you have questions, feel free to use the chat box. If you want to raise your hand and for some reason have a dialogue, we have that ability to as well. So Perrin, the ball is in your court. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Jim. I really appreciate you and Abi and all the members of CareStack having me and Diwakar on this afternoon and hopefully sharing a little bit of wisdom. Rest assured that Diwakar only has a severe head cold and it cannot be transmitted through a webinar. So let's hope that a lot of people are coming through this week unscathed, so to speak, and this might be a little bit of a respite in terms of a learning opportunity. So our company, of which Diwakar and I are two of the three co-founding principals, the third being our partner, Kpis, Tusk Partners, provides industry-leading resources for group dental practices and DSOs. We primarily focus in that, call it 1 to 25-ish location range, and those are pre-private equity groups. So all the groups we work with are doctor-founded and debt-funded, as we like to say. And in today's environment, the last week and a half to 2 weeks notwithstanding, let's face it, building and operating a successful group practice isn't for the faint of heart. There are days where you feel like you only see the tip of the iceberg and it's what's below the waterline that can really hurt you. There are days that you feel like an elephant trying to scale a rope and climb up it with no opposable thumbs. And then every now and again, you hit that highlight point where you feel like popping the cork on a bottle of champagne and really celebrating some wins. And those days, if they aren't here this week, are coming soon. This is still a wonderful industry to be a part of that has a tremendous amount of upside. So Tusk, our company, helps entrepreneurial dentists start, grow, and ultimately sell their group practice or DSO. So depending on where you are in that journey from one location to much more than one, we have a variety of services that can help you in terms of figuring out if you want to build a group practice, if you have taken on the initiative to build a group practice, things like associate equity models, debt recapitalization models, and certainly strategic consulting would be right in your interest wheelhouse. And if you're a successful entrepreneur who's created a successful business and want to take some chips off the table, we offer sell-side advisory to a private equity type buyer or an enterprise level group. We've been very fortunate to call on a number of friends in the industry and do a lot of work with a lot of third parties, CareStack being notable among them, and have a high admiration for that company. My partner, Diwakar Sinha, has spent his career in healthcare banking in the lending market, most recently VP of healthcare sales for a bank out of Pasadena called East West Bank, which was arguably the preeminent lender in the entire group practice space. And for those who are using debt funds to grow their business, there is a significant difference in using debt funds to grow a group versus using debt funds to buy your first or second location. And it's worth learning the difference because ultimately nobody's bootstrapping these businesses and everybody's using debt funds to do it. My background specifically is in sales and leadership and operations management. I spent 15 years working for Patterson Dental Supply and ran 3 different businesses for them pretty successfully over that time span. Today's agenda, we're going to hit the highlights on 3 different areas. The first is what we call the income versus wealth dilemma. And that's for the founders of these businesses who are going to be transitioning from a clinical dentist to what you would call the CEO or visionary of that business. The second point is going to be surviving that transition of what we call a lifestyle business to a more growth-focused platform and specifically being intentional about that. And the third key point is going to be defining the key performance indicator that private equity groups use to evaluate overall performance of businesses. And it might not be what you're accustomed to looking at. And then obviously we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers to the end. I'm going to take the bulk of the presentation today because Diwakar's voice is not holding up real great. I'll bring him in intermittently through the presentation and also certainly to draw on his experience throughout, but also to handle some of the question and answer part of it toward the end. So let's kick in first and foremost to what we call the income versus wealth dilemma. And one of the 3 biggest challenges we see in establishing and growing a group in the beginning stages is the founder's dilemma, essentially. And that is their personal transition from being typically the largest clinical producer to a CEO or visionary role. And the reason that that's a challenge is because income and wealth are competing interests. When you are a clinical dentist, you, and certainly the business owner, you're probably making a very healthy amount of personal income that's derived from clinical services. However, when you transition to a CEO type of a role, the success or failure of that is going to be around generating more wealth. And that is not the same thing as clinical income. So that transition essentially is one that is often at odds with one another. If you are the largest clinical producer in your group, being the founder, it's a challenge of the business when you start to cut back on days of clinical production. Obviously, you're doing a healthy amount of clinical dentistry, and any distraction or time away from that immediately creates revenue challenges for the business. There's obviously not as much dentistry being done if you start devoting more days to being the CEO or the visionary of the business. At the same time, none of us do what we do for free. And it's okay to have a lifestyle that's tied to the compensation you derive from any business, be it clinical dentistry or otherwise. But suffice to say, if we start to step away from the chair and step away from some of that clinical compensation, those days that you leave behind start to create income challenges for you and your family. And nobody wants to see their lifestyle take a hit on account of a job transition. The obvious thing to do is to hire an associate to backfill behind you and pick up some of the work that you've left behind as you transition out of the chair. But to state the obvious, you've got to pay them to do that work. So it's going to be difficult to pay the associate to do the work that you gave up and keep your personal income level at the same that it was when you were doing all the clinical dentistry, because the business usually can't afford to pay you and pay an associate for the same amount of work that gets done.
Perrin, can we
so if you want to grow,
yeah, there's a question from the audience about that. You can go back to that slide for a moment.
Sure.
If you could share an anecdote from your experience of where, you know, a situation where someone struggled with that and kind of how you kind of work them through that process.
Yeah, I tell you what, can you hang tight, because I'm going to actually put some math to that on the next page, and I'll tell you the way we think about it. So
great question, though.
But a good. I'm just glad to know that the audience is aligned with our general train of thought. Sometimes when you build these presentations, you're never really sure how they're going to land, right? So going back to the founder's transition from clinical dentist to CEO or visionary, obviously, if you're going to grow the business by locations, more than one, somebody's got to lead it. And somebody's got to be responsible for creating the vision and setting the cadence and the overall opportunities to acquire or build more locations. That doesn't happen on its own. And usually the founder of these businesses is the visionary, the de facto visionary, if you will, and they are the ones who are best equipped to lead the business as it continues to grow. Again, there's usually not enough time or energy to be a full-time, fully practicing clinical dentist, especially generating the volume that most of those people do, as well as devoting multiple days to being the visionary or CEO of the business. Time and effort, so to speak, tend to be in competition with one another. The roles are obviously at odds with one another, and one is very proactive, whereas one is arguably reactive. This is the mindset of working on the business as the CEO versus in the business as a clinical producer in the business. The other aspect of this is that a CEO of an emerging group practice simply isn't going to make, in terms of income, the amount of salary what a high producing dentist will in terms of clinical compensation. Typically, a CEO of, you know, a 4 to 6 location group, for example, is going to earn somewhere around $1,000 to $1,500 per day working in that role, taken over about 250 working days in the year is going to be about $250,000 to $375,000 in total compensation as a CEO.
Yeah, on a clinical side, if you're trying to evaluate what that looks like for a clinical CEO, that's adjusted production or collections, depending on your comp rate, anywhere from $750,000 to $1 million is what you're ranging for. And typically, most of our lead doctors are at that performance level. We have some doctors, many doctors that are at $1.5 to $2 million in annual production. And those are the outliers, one would argue. But I think if you're building a group practice, you typically need to be at the higher level of performance amongst your peers. And that's around $800,000 to $1 million in clinical production, which is roughly around $4,000 per day to $5,000 per day. On a 4 days a week, 50 weeks a year. Again, depending on the comp rate, gives you about $250 to $375 or your daily minimum comp rate should be around $1,000 to $1,500 per day.
Yeah, thank you for.
I'm just glad you found your voice, Diwakar.
When I mute it, I've lost it again.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So let's see here. There we go. So the question becomes, how can you maintain your clinical level of income without actually doing clinical work? And I think that's the challenge we're trying to solve for. And sometimes the first step in terms of solving for that answer is going to be found in actually determining what the numbers are behind it. We at Tusk are a very numbers analytically driven type of a business, and we usually search for either guidance or solutions in the numbers. And here's how some of that stacks up when we talk about quantifying the value and also measuring the impact you need to make. So let's walk through a scenario to replace yourself in a clinical role. And this is a very simplistic example, but hopefully the numbers are nice and round and they're kind of easy to follow, at least conceptually speaking. So if this is $1 million collection business and it's split 80-20 between clinical and hygiene, the dentist in this scenario is generating $800,000 worth of clinical collections. If we paid a dentist, an associate to replace us, or if we paid ourselves a clinical compensation rate as if we were an associate, that clinical compensation rate might be 30% of collections. Put another way, 30% of $800,000 worth of clinical collections is clinical level income of $240,000. If this business is running a 60% overhead rate, you take your $1 million in total collections, less your overhead rate, and less your clinical income, and you're left with an entrepreneurial profit around $160,000. Entrepreneurial profit is a close enough approximation of Ebitda, which is the metric by which all group practices are measured. And in this scenario, we're showing an Ebitda margin of about 16%. Now, if you're the owner of this business outright, and it's $1 million collection business that's running a 60% overhead rate for $600,000, you're probably pulling out a total of $400,000 worth of income out of the business in its entirety. $240,000 of that is derived from clinical services, and the other $160,000 could be income from distributions, just as an example.
Hey, Perrin, before we move on here, and Diwakar, there's a question from the audience, and you just talked about close approximation. One of our audience members wants to know, what are the other factors that would, you say close, but what's a mitigating or modifying factor why it's not an exact approximation? Can you give a little more depth on that they're asking for?
Is this in reference to my previous statement as far as the different factors that go into calculating comp rate?
No, I think it's back to entrepreneurial profit. So they're saying it's, for DSO, it's a close approximation. So what may not be considered in here for it to really be an exact approximation of Ebitda?
Well, so I mean, I think in this case, this is an Excel formula, right? So in this case, if those assumptions are exactly accurate, and you were to pull a tax return and an 1120S, and you pull the EagleSoft or Dentrix or a CareStack report, and you pull the production by provider report, and you see doctor productions 800,000 and hygiene productions at 200,000. Then you have to do the analysis of the overhead of the business. So the assumptions, there are certain assumptions that 60% is the overhead in this business. One would,
okay,
if you follow the ADA statistics, the ADA would say overhead on the average runs around 65%. So again, it's a close approximation to what ADA may recommend versus what we would say. We would say, I think our clients run at a more operationally higher, less overhead, profitable level. So, we would say 60% is the overhead, 40% is the owner profit. So in this case, if the $800,000 is a clinical production on a production by provider reports, and we have one provider, and you were to specifically pay them 30% of collections, your assumed comp rate would be $240,000 would be W-2. Now, a lot of private practitioners may talk to their CPA. I'm not a CPA, but they may recommend for different tax strategies not to pay themselves $240,000 in a W-2. There might be some Medicare savings, some tax savings, different tax strategies that may go into play. So they might be paying themselves $120,000 to $180,000, and the balance they may be taking through a distribution or other deductions in their business. So what we do, when we look at this EBITDA structure, or we look at this Excel formula, we actually add back all those adjustments that might be discretionary decisions in the business and try to say, okay, under ideal situations, when we look at Tusk clients, I think Tusk clients run at a little bit better, more operationally profit level. So let's say 60% versus the 65 on the ADA. And we're still able to pay a clinician 30% of adjusted production or collection. Again, those comp rates may matter based on demographics and specialty. You're paying $240,000 in clinical comp. In this case, the entrepreneurial profit is $160,000. That's very important to understand. EBITDA is not free cash flow. You know, after the EBITDA position of $160,000, you still have debt service. You know, so free cash flow is actually, you know, after debt service, what is your free cash flow? So most businesses around $1 million, and I apologize, my voice is slowly going away. At $1 million in production or collections, probably have a $500,000 or $600,000 loan obligation outstanding on debt on balance sheet. The average debt on that is roughly around $6,000 a month, $72,000 a year. So if you were to deduct the $72,000 a year from the, from the 160, you have roughly about $88,000 in free cash flow. Well, $88,000 in free cash flow is not necessarily dollars that are distributable. You still have tax obligations outstanding on the 160 minus the interest expense, any capital expense you might have done. So again, there's a lot of variables that go into to truly understand what EBITDA is and what free cash flow is. But I think we're trying to show here is one component of this analysis is EBITDA. But really, if we were to, and we don't have the time on this webinar, and maybe that's a subsequent webinar with you guys, is really understanding what free cash flow means to an operator, not just EBITDA. For now, to show how you grow your business and how you're able to bring in an associate and really be an operator on the business versus a clinician, we're using EBITDA as an approximation of free cash flow to say that's what the business can sustain and how do we improve that.
Great, thank you for speaking to that. Sorry if I derailed you guys.
No, quite all right. So when we look at this scenario, and this is, again, just a loose example to try to convey a point, what we're trying to draw the distinction between is the amount of clinical income. If you hire an associate to backfill behind you, how much you're going to have to pay that person to do the services that you're no longer providing, as well as the potential impact you're going to have to make in the organization as the CEO to generate enough income from distribution to make yourself whole. And in this scenario, the way you work the math backwards is to say the personal clinical income that you are no longer deriving because you're not providing clinical services, you're now paying an associate to do that, and the margin that the business throws off at 16%, you divide your personal clinical level income by the margin of the business to generate a top line revenue impact that you need to make as the CEO of the business. Now, this is a very simplistic, probably one location example. And when you look at the bottom line, you see a $1.5 million, people immediately wave the white flag saying that's an impossibility, which it probably is in one location. That being said, most people who are transitioning out of a full-time clinical role, they may practice clinical dentistry 4 days a week and be the CEO 1 day a week. And what we advise our clients to do is not transition cold turkey, so to speak, but start dropping 1 day a week per quarter or every 6 months, whatever they feel is reasonable, as the business continues to grow and as they are able to make a greater impact on the business from a leadership context. And when you start thinking about it in those terms, making $1 million impact on the business through acquisitions, as well as other revenue generation opportunities like specialty services, marketing efforts, and the like, quickly can add up and replace some of the clinical level income with distribution level income. And this is also not taking into account any impact that the new CEO would make at the marginal level, i.e. through gained efficiencies, reduced expenses, potentially reducing headcount and the like, to make both a top line impact as well as a bottom line impact to replace that income.
Yeah,
So I
and
think the first step in this is starting with understanding the amount that you need to replace. I'm sorry, Diwakar, go ahead.
and I apologize. So I mean, I think just to kind of expand beyond it, you know, when you look at the bottom tab and it shows 16%, and it assumes, to Perrin's point, that the margin is not improving in a business. But one would argue, if your fixed operating expenses are covered at $1 million to a certain point, which is rent and to some level wage expense, and you know, you have some variability in doctor compensation, assistant or hygiene, things like that. One would argue that the last $500,000 would be more profitable than the first $1 million. So you may or may not need that extra 500,000, but this is a very conservative, stress-tested approach to what you need to be looking at. Another thing to think about, again, you know, traditionally when we see the private practice space, private practitioners open 4 days a week. And to, you know, Perrin's statements in the past, majority of them are lifestyle businesses. They're open 3 to 4 days. They're not open 5 days. You know, we want to look at the market demand and say, how can we be open 5 days? And really, you know, the doctor may, to Perrin's comment of staging the exit, I would personally want to have an associate come in there on a Friday and work the Friday and keep the schedule full. And if I can produce $4,000 a day on a Friday, 50 weeks a year, that's $200,000, right? And if one could argue, let's remove the 16% EBITDA, one would argue that on the last $200,000, 50 cents of every dollar is pure profit, because you've covered everything else, right? Your variable expenses are doctor compensation, assistant hygiene, lab, supplies, utilities don't really go up. Rent is the same on 4 days as it on 5 days. You might have increased marketing cost, right, to drive the patient revenue for the 5th day. But the extra $200,000 in revenue, if you have an extra $100,000 in profit, now that allows you to go from 4 days a week clinical to 3 days a week clinical. Now you work with the doctor to mentor him or her to improve their production to your replacement level. And then you start working on operational efficiencies to realize, how can you be more efficient in the business? Maybe acquire a second practice. I mean, there's a process to get there. But I think one of the key things I would ask is, and you know, we'll get in this in the webinar, and hopefully some people ask questions about the economic correction, is, you know, majority of private practices are lifestyle businesses. You know, I mean, I want to, you know, look at and have everybody in this webinar look at and say, let's build a business that's not a lifestyle business. Let's build a business that takes care of the community, that provides the access to care to the community, that provides a stable employment place for the team members that work there, and is open more than 3 or 4 days a week, and really, and you can still work 3 days a week clinically. Nothing says you can't work 3 days a week clinically, but let's be open 5 days a week. Let's provide the most access to care. Let's build a 4 to 5 chair facility doing $1.5 million.
Hey, gentlemen, we got to keep moving here. I know you got a lot of good content. We do have a question, but we're going to come back to that and bring it back in the parking lot at the end, if that's all right.
Yep. So next section is, how big is too big? And this is the transition from what we would consider a lifestyle business to a more of a growth-focused platform. The question being, do you want to go big, or do you want to keep it small and keep it all? And this is a point that a lot of people, I'll say, stumble into without too much intentionality. But it really comes back to the question that we ask our clients: what are you trying to build and why? You want to be intentional about your operational strategy, because it obviously will directly impact your growth strategy. If your goal is to have a 3 to 5 location group, that obviously doesn't really require centralized services, a back-end platform, so to speak, you know, corporate level services that support those locations. You can probably manage 3 to 5 locations just fine without too much in terms of centralization, maybe a regional manager, and probably the founder, owner, doctor is still practicing clinically, not necessarily, but if they so choose, there is that ability. The business isn't too terribly large if these are, and too terribly large or cumbersome, if these are what I might call typically sized businesses. We're not talking about, you know, 5, 20 operatory buildings or something like that. If you do want to get towards double digits in terms of number of locations, it most certainly does require some level of centralization. And if you don't want to invest in centralization, and when I say invest, that's time and money and effort to do it, then you probably need to be committed to staying under 5 locations. An efficient lifestyle business that produces solid income is the envy of a lot of people, and one that is still, frankly, very fun to own and operate. But if you want to grow to 8 to 10 or more locations, you really do need to be committed to investing in centralized services, because an efficient platform or a dental services organization, DSO, at 8 to 10 locations is one that could produce incredible wealth, and that's beyond solid income. So a couple of things to keep in mind in terms of services to centralize, and there are a plethora of them that you can see here. Everything from call center oriented functions, certainly insurance and AR and AP, all your human resources and payroll, accounting and controller functions, procurement, banking and finance, IS and IT, including CareStack, obviously, the business development team, the clinical development team, recruiting and development, and then audit and compliance as it relates to financial, operational, and clinical services. If you choose to go whole hog and really want to scale a large organization, you are probably going to centralize all of those functions at some point, and it's going to require a lot of square feet to do it. Or on the other hand, if yours is a more methodical growth strategy, might it be better to pick and choose or prioritize those services and phase them in over time to both maintain control of those functions, as well as to minimize potentially some of the cash outlay or the investment required along the way to do it. Obviously, budgeting is critically important to achieving any and all of the above. So let's quantify the value once again in terms of metrics to gauge the overall efficiency of the centralized services that you're hoping to create. DSO overhead typically is going to fall somewhere in the range of 5 to 8% of revenue. That's depending on the amount of headcount in there and obviously a lot of the scope of services. But a 5 to 8% of revenue range is probably what you're looking at in terms of overall DSO overhead. There's a concept that got drilled into us at Patterson when I worked there called operating leverage. And it's the hallmark of every well-run business, irrespective of industry, and one that you probably want to know and understand. Essentially, operating leverage is growing the bottom line at a faster rate than the top line. We used to have a saying at Patterson that probably many of you have heard at some point in the past, and that is that sales cover sins. The opportunity to simply cure all of your ills by growing the top line is something that seduces people, and we all love talking about revenue generation, but we all get paid to create more bottom line impact. And sometimes that involves taking redundant headcount out of the business, especially if you're going to centralize services like call center functions and the like. Ultimately, this means driving more efficient delivery of services overall and increasing the profitability with lower levels of required investment. So the last piece today before we transition into Q&A is around something called utilization rate. Everyone seems to ask us, what are the metrics I need to be paying attention to in my business? What are KPIs and OKRs and whatever other acronym you want to come up with? What is the thing to know? And everybody has spreadsheets upon spreadsheets of KPIs that they track, and they sometimes get something that we call paralysis through analysis. But the key performance indicator that private equity groups use to evaluate performance is one called utilization rate. And it really gets down to, are you really getting the most productivity out of your business? So if you run a great business, that's probably going to be a question posed according to whom. So here's what one might look like. My practice generates $1.2 million in collections. The ADA average general dentistry practice collects about $650,000. So because I'm almost twice that large, I obviously run a great business. Well, how many operatories do you have? I have 6, so that's $200,000 per operatory, which is a pretty good number overall for general dentistry. How many days a week are you open? 5 days per week. And how many hours per day are you open? 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., which is 8 hours per day if we take an hour for lunch, and 5 days a week. And how many weeks a year are you open? 50 weeks per year. So when we boil all this down to what you might consider a least common denominator approach, and you look at the capacity opportunity for the business, that's measured in productivity per chair per hour. And you take 6 operatories times 5 days a week times 8 hours a day times 50 weeks a year, and you divide that number into $1.2 million in collections, and you end up with a number that's $100 per chair per hour. Is that still impressive to you? Well, maybe, maybe not. It might be if you don't have any a frame of reference for it, because going back to 1.2 million in collections is a pretty decent number. On the other hand, could this be a story of unfulfilled potential? And the standard, according to private equity groups, when they look at businesses and the way they measure revenue generation, is they are looking for $175 per chair per hour. So that $1.2 million collection business that we just showed, while it has probably nice top line overall revenue, might be a practice that they would see a lot of untapped potential. The other thing, to echo Diwakar's point earlier about EBITDA margins, is that when we work with groups, we really want to get them into the 18 to 25% EBITDA margin range, and that's for most general dentistry groups. Specialty is typically a little bit higher. More EBITDA margin is usually better. And obviously, the larger the group gets, you should gain efficiencies through centralization and should end up with higher margins from a consolidated standpoint when you look at the business overall. So when we take a look at really quantifying the value, you may be proud of the business that you've built. It generates $1.2 million in collections spread out over 6 operatories, 8 hours per day, 5 days a week, and 50 weeks a year, and generating hourly revenue of about $100 per chair per hour. If it has an EBITDA margin of 15% and is valued at a 5 times multiple, that business might be worth $900,000. But to somebody else, there could be a lot of unrealized potential. And if they're able to drive target hourly production from $100 to $175, and if they're able to increase the EBITDA margin at the same time, this is that concept of operating leverage once again, they're getting top line revenue generation and margin expansion, they're able to generate $900,000 in additional production and almost $500,000, $462,000 in this example, in EBITDA potential, which shows that the potential valuation of the business at a 5 times multiple goes from $900,000 over $2.3 million and a valuation gap of $1.4 million. And I can tell you the benefit in our business is that we get to work with a lot of enterprise level DSOs because they're usually very interested in acquiring the multi-location groups that we represent in the exit side of our business. And we understand how they look at the untapped potential of what could arguably be a very well-run type of a business that we're representing for sale. And when they realize valuation gaps like this, they are incredibly interested in acquiring the business, not for what it's doing today, but what they can get it to do in the future. So let's define what success looks like. The first step is wealth over income. Wealth is built through building a business that's really not dependent upon you, at least from a clinical capacity standpoint. We encourage you to be intentional about your personal transition. To do that, know the top line impact you have to create to maintain your personal level of income, and then commit to working on the business, not just in the business. You want to focus on efficiency over it just being easy. And efficiency is obviously a lot harder to achieve. Staying small is easy, but creating efficiency is hard. Centralizing services can be done incrementally, but it's always a costly investment, and long-term bets require patience and staying the course in order for them to pay off. And then focusing more on small units over big ones. Focusing on small changes that result in a big and dramatic impact of the organization. And per chair per hour is the ultimate least common denominator approach to measuring productivity. EBITDA margin is the ultimate measure of profitability and your ability to continuously generate that profitability. And then operating leverage is that ultimate level of efficiency that we mentioned before. If you can balance all three of those.
Perrin, we have a couple of questions that came in. Do you want to keep going here and do them at the end? What do you and Diwakar prefer?
Well, I'll hit the next slide for you, Jim, because voila, there it is. Why don't we take some questions and hopefully provide some answers, Jim?
Sure. So the first one is coming, I'm going to read it verbatim. Is there a case where the business is run so well, it becomes unattractive to a DSO? And have you seen that in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the question, I think that's a fair question to be asked. I think the question ends up, a buyer would ask is, if industry norms in a business is running at a 20%, let's use that as a norm for some business, and I see a business performing at 30% versus a 20%, that would be a 50% improvement to the industry norm. The answer would be why, right? And if the answer is Jim's running a great business and he's the reason people are doing what they are, then I have a key employee issue that I have to retain. In an evaluation position, I have to work through that as a process. We do see businesses that are run exceptionally well. Usually there's at least one reason. Sometimes it's an employee issue. Sometimes there's outlier aspects that are outside the business norm. You do see some adjustment for that risk. So if the normal business is running at a 20% margin in that specific spectrum, and this business is running at a 30% margin, do I think 30% margin is going to be taken for the grain of salt? Probably not. I think you're going to see substantial due diligence to validate that 30%. And if I'm in a selling position, I would be comfortable to say that more than likely 30% will not be honored. And again, these are all hypothetical scenarios that'll probably be settling around 25 to 27%. I don't think it's fair to say that you'd be going down to the industry norm at 20%, but I think it'd be unfair to say that you will get 100% dollar for dollar credit for the exceptional position you're doing, because in all the situations we've seen, there's several reasons. And in most cases, again, I say in most cases, it doesn't replicate for the same history for the purchaser.
Jim, I'll also add a quick comment on that because I'll give you something I would say factual, which is that we represented a seller in a major right outside of a major metropolitan market. It was a late 40s doctor with 2 hygienists, 5 operatories, and the practice generated $2.5 million worth of collections and was 100% fee for service. You can make a really good case that doctor is getting the absolute max out of their opportunity. And we saw an enterprise level DSO acquire that business for a very healthy percentage of collections multiple and EBITDA multiple. And the reason they were willing to pay a high number for it was a couple of things. They saw 5 operatories with the ability to drop in a 6th and convert a staff lounge so they could increase capacity. That doctor was working 3.5 to 4 days a week, but did not have an associate in place. The enterprise level DSO felt that if they could add another operatory and open on a full day Thursday, a full day Friday, and potentially a Saturday, that they could drop an associate in there and create more revenue generation opportunities. And the fact that it was fee for service 100% was one where they felt like if they wanted to take a couple of insurance plans, they could increase new patient counts into that particular practice. So, we may think that the business is running like a top, but the way somebody else evaluates it is all about potential upside. And I haven't found one business yet where everybody walked away saying, man, there's just no way to get anything more out of that.
That's good, great insights. Thank you for addressing those. Just kind of shifting gears here for a moment, we have a question about KPIs. And what KPIs should I, as a practice owner or operator, should I track on a daily basis?
Yeah, so and I think it's important to go into your practice management report. There's daily huddle reports that I think CareStack can pull out and the team members can focus on. And I think the key thing comes in if you're thinking about how do I get this utilization rate of $175 in production per hour per chair. The question to look at is what's your new patient flow look like? What's your new patient value look like? And what's your open chair time on a historical basis and a forward basis? I think if we look at the airline industry, exclusive of now, the airline industry does a very good job in filling seats. And I can't imagine the last flight I took where I had the entire row to myself. Maybe 10 years ago, there might be flights where I would see some entire rows to myself. So I think the key thing is your team, when they look at the daily huddle report at night or the next day, are they looking at what their vacancy position is and what your reappointment is? Meaning, so if I have a 4-chair operatory and I'm open 8 hours a day, I have 32 hours of chair time available within that day. How many at the opening, what was the open schedule time? So let's say out of the 32 chairs, I had scheduled 30 hours of patient time, right? So my vacancy is only 2 hours. But then life happens, and at the end of the day, I only had 25 hours of scheduled patient time. That means at the end of the day, I had a 25 to 30% vacancy rate. Well, if I know historically at the end of the day over a long period, my vacancy rate is 30%, then I have to do a better job in patient confirmation and making sure potentially I book out at 32 hours to leave less open chair time. I think that's the way to think about your business. Also look at your reappointment rate. I think I've seen businesses, I'll give an example. We had a business that for last 6 months, they engaged us. They were at 100% reappointment rate. One would again argue that's a pretty exceptional reappointment rate. That would be rare. Then we started looking at daily vacancy rate. So when we started looking at daily vacancy rate, the business had a 20% to 25% daily vacancy rate. So I asked the operations person, can you please tell me if your reappointment rate's 100%, how's your vacancy rate at 25%? And kind of just pause there for a moment and wait for the answer. And seldom do I get the right answer. And I think the question ends up being, what is the process? Whenever you see something really be outside the norm, you got to ask the question. And in this case, people are just putting an appointment in the system versus actually asking the patient, what is the right time for an appointment? So then go back to the question, the KPIs for the daily, they should be, what's your new patients by source? What is production by doctor? Each doctor needs to be identified so we can outlier in a multi-provider situation. If we have a doctor that continuously is underperforming, how many patients seen by doctor? How many patients seen by each hygienist? What's the patients collected for the number of patients that are not collected? The dollar amount collected is important because we want to understand what daily collections look like on an over-the-counter basis. But the number of patients not collected is also important because sometimes it gets skewed. If I had one patient I didn't collect from, and my outstanding was $2,000, okay, that's a isolated incident. But if I had $500 not collected, let's turn the tables, but I had 9 patients I didn't collect from, that's a process issue.
Right.
So it's you have to, and we always tell our clients, you have to look 2 points of data point to validate the information you're getting and validate the behavior and validate your logic. Any one data point can mislead you to a hypothesis that you may want to believe or your team wants you to believe.
Thank you. We have a participant who wants to ask a question live, so I'm going to unmute their line. Aki, if you want to go ahead, and I'm trying to unmute here. Maybe I might not be working. All right, let's come back to that. I think it's a technological issue on my end. Okay, so the next question that we have is, are there any rules of thumb for how multiples paid grow as Ebitda increases in size?
I can take a little bit of that one if you want, Diwakar, and give your voice a rest for a second. I mean, so we talk about Ebitda multiples kind of as a stair step, not as a linear graph. And I think this is a really broad generalization, okay? I mean, with not a whole lot of specifics other than to say that the $1 million of Ebitda tends to attract a lot more buyers because that means the business is of some size and substance and usually historical performance in terms of stability that attracts a lot more buyers. And usually if there are more buyers, that means that the multiple will tick up commensurately. $1 million in EBITDA is probably that, in the 5 to 6 multiple range or something like that. We see a business that has about $3 million in EBITDA. Things, again, I don't want to say magical things start happening, but it attracts a lot more interested buyer parties, as well as a number of established private equity groups. Private equity groups usually have a minimum threshold of EBITDA below which they will not make an investment. So they're looking for a threshold. It's always above $1 million, but usually in the 2 to 3 range. So I'd say the first tick is at $1 million, the second's about 3, and then $4 to $5 million in EBITDA is a very well established and very successful, arguably, group practice in our world these days. And those are ones that have typically established platform characteristics, centralization, like we mentioned before, and the opportunity for scale, and usually an operator that is created a level of success. So I think you could call it 1, 3, and 5 million just to throw darts at a wall, but those are good reference points, if nothing more.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions, and I want to have a chance for you guys to kind of summarize a little bit. So the next one that's kind of in order here on this topic is how population demographic impacts potential of revenue. One town has 15,000 population and a median income of 113,000, and another has an 80,000 person population and a median income of 80,000.
Oh, I think
I want to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple variables that go into it, but just on the surface, one would argue that the population with 15,000 and a median income of 113,000, it's a higher per capita income. So I would probably see a more aesthetic, more cosmetic practice there, versus the other might be more of a PPO practice. So again, just not putting a broad brush on a demographic, but just the per capita income would drive the type of dentistry that would be in that situation. But you also have a situation. You also have competition that would drive that. So if you have the 15,000 patients has 10 dentists, that's 1,500 patients per dentist. One would say that's a very competitive environment, especially for the per capita income. That would be a lot of fee for service, high-end cosmetic dentistry. Versus on the other side, in the 80,000 population, if you had 10 dentists, that'd be one patient to every 8,000, one dentist every 8,000 patients. That'd be a fairly great opportunity for a PPO business that could be open with multiple providers. So I think I don't know if I answered that question correctly, but I think there's more than to answer the question of impact potential. One would have to look at multiple factors in the business and the type of business that practice wants to be in, and the type of care it wants to provide, and how the procedures are scheduled to be able to drive what the max potential of that business is.
Okay, great, thank you for speaking to that. Perrin, I want to give you a chance to kind of advance a couple slides, and then kind of the closing question that the audience, I've had a couple of questions come across about the long-term ramifications of the coronavirus. And I don't want to tease that too much, but I want to give you a chance. Let's come back to that in a moment. I know you just want to kind of give a quick overview about what Tusk does. And I think it's fair for the audience to hear that for a moment or two, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be really fast. And thank you for the opportunity to just kind of state who we are. And again, we work only in the group practice realm. We don't do anything in any other healthcare vertical. And we don't work with private equity-backed groups. Ours are all doctor-founded and debt-funded. And I got a question on, will we get a copy of these slides? And yes, we can make a copy of the slides available. I'm not sure about a recording, Jim, if you're recording this or you're going to...
Yeah, we're going to send a recording to everyone who's subscribed. Yes, they'll get a recording. So thank you for bringing that up.
Great. I think just the nutshell in terms of recap here, is that if you're a doctor in a solo location and you're interested in potentially building a group and you literally don't know what you don't know, we have a service called a full day deep dive. That's an 8-hour day in our office that might be something worth pursuing If you are building a group and you've run into what we call the debt funding wall, which is your primary lender doesn't want to lend your next acquisition, there's probably a reason for that. But we have a debt recapitalization service called Second Stage Financing that's growth capital with a guidance line for groups that are more interested in growing, well, through acquisition or de novo or a blend of both for that matter. Our blueprints for success is our strategic consulting. There's a lot in there to explain, but essentially it's C-suite consulting. We work with the leaders of businesses to formulate their growth strategy and help them execute on that. That's revenue generation, expense containment, EBITDA maximization, and ultimately the opportunity to work with the human capital in the business to create greater outcomes. And then obviously, like I mentioned before, if you are a successful entrepreneurial dentist and you want to take some chips off the table, and find a financial buyer like a private equity group or a strategic buyer like an established DSO to work with in the next phase of the overall business development. We offer M&A advisory services exclusively for founder-owner doctors of group dental practices. There's a lot to our business, and you can learn more about us online, and our website is tusk-partners.com. Again, tusk-partners.com. There's full contact information there as well.
Great. So one more slide. I want to show our upcoming program. Thank you, Perrin. I appreciate that. So again, CareStack is providing content that's not specific to our products. And our next webinar is going to be hosted by Jonathan Escal. I'll be the moderator. We're going to have one other panelist too as well to be determined. And the focus will be on dental deal structures of 2020. And with what's going on in the world right now, where we are in a month from now, I think there's going to be a lot to talk about. And I really, you'll start seeing posts from CareStack on our LinkedIn page. And if you're on our emailing lists, you will receive more notifications about this, but you can mark your calendar for Tuesday, April 14th from 1 to 2 o'clock. So the last question, and then we'll kind of wrap things up here, is talking about long-term ramifications. What is your perspective from Tusk from the fallout of the coronavirus? And if you want to take a couple of minutes here and then we'll bring things to conclusion, that would be great.
Perrin,
Diwakar, do you want that one?
All right. Yeah, so I mean, I think, so again, none of us have a crystal ball into what will happen in there. But I mean, for people that know me, I'm a fairly bullish person about where the market is today and fairly optimistic of where we're headed. And I think, I'm not trying to minimize the virus or anything like that, but I do think there's some inflated information in regards to what's happening. I do understand the precautionary measures that are being taken out there. It is for everyone's safety. But the market correction, we'd all had asked the question, what is the market correction? This is the market correction. There's insight from the financial services industry that provides us data that there's no systemic risk out there in the market. Cash positions for a lot of publicly traded companies are strong. If you look at the companies that are in financial turmoil, or one would argue the stock prices are low in the travel industry or the oil industry, and you look at cash and balance sheets and operating free cash flow, they're in great position. If you look at bank cash positions and reserves, they're in great position. So if we were to try to put this into 2008 economic position, this is not it. If I was to put a relative position and be loose about this, and again, I'm being very broad stroke about it, I would look at 2001 or the early 90s economic correction as more of a reflection point of where we are. All indications from all the data that's coming out from the financial service industry is that we'll see recovery in Q3 and the market's going to rebound in Q3 to Q4. So this is a correction that was long overdue. Now, to answer the question, the dental space, we are working with clients in regards to positioning, how their burn through rate is within their businesses. We are working actively with them with that, but we're also working on capital solutions, as Perrin talked about. Most of our clients are 3, 5, 10 locations. So we're working on, how do we look at the growth strategy and pivot the growth strategy with the correction? And work with the community to, as some private practitioners are going to have a tough time coming back into the business. The banks, they may not be as compromising. So how do we work with them to help them provide a place to land for them and their team? How do you work with landlords to look at some kind of a reprieve on rent or different strategies that are out there that do not impact your credit that are available out there. The short answer is, I think, my goal is the next 2-3 weeks, hopefully latest 3 weeks, we're opening dental offices, the communications coming from the dental societies and dental boards to do that, and that people are positioned well and proactive to go back. But I think if I could give one recommendation to people that are on this webinar is calculate your burn through rate. Look at what your cash position is today, and look at your total cash position and what your burn through rate would be over the next 30 to 45 days, and how you're going to restart your engine. Really, restarting your engine is the key thing.
Great. Thank you for covering that. Really appreciate it. We're at our allocated time. Perrin, if you just want to bring up your slide with your contact information, if people want to take a screenshot, if they want to reach out to you, obviously the website, tusk-partners.com. But also, you guys have your emails up there. I know you're encouraging people to reach out to you. And thank you very much. So again, as a recap, everyone who's participated today is going to receive a recording probably tomorrow, maybe Friday, from me at CareStack. So make sure my email is not blocked in your inbox. And really thank you. Thank you to Perrin and Diwakar for your time and for contributing today. And thank you everyone for your time and attending. Have a great rest of your day.
All right,
Thanks, Jim and Abhi. We appreciate it very much. Take care.
You got it. Take care.
Bye-bye.